Taylor Cervantes. Taylor Cervantes was 27 years old on the night of April 30th, 2023, when a 53-year-old inmate named Edward Bergman was found unresponsive in his cell at California State Prison, Sacramento. Bergman was already serving life without parole for a first-degree murder out of San Diego County. Cervantes was serving his own life sentence for second-degree murder, one he had received only 18 months earlier. The question that would follow the killing of Edward Bergman is not who did it. It is why, more than 2 years later, there is still no public record of what happened after. To understand what happened that night requires understanding where Cervantes had been sent. California State Prison, Sacramento, informally known as New Folsom, is a Level 4 maximum security facility that opened in 1986 on land next to the older, more famous Folsom State Prison. Unlike Old Folsom, which had been softened over the decades into a medium-security institution, New Folsom was designed to hold the state's most dangerous inmates. When Cervantes arrived, he was placed among men serving life sentences, many with nothing left to lose. Edward Bergman was one of those men. He had been convicted in 1997 for a first-degree murder in San Diego County. Before that conviction, he had a long record of nonviolent property crimes, including several burglary and arson counts. He had been in the California prison system for more than 25 years by the night his life ended. According to the report released by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, at approximately 11:39 on the night of April 30th, 2023, officers responded to Bergman's cell and found him unresponsive. Life-saving measures were attempted. He was pronounced dead at 8 minutes past midnight on May 1st. When investigators searched the scene, they recovered an inmate-manufactured weapon. Cervantes was identified as the suspect and rehoused to restricted housing within hours. The department did not release the specific circumstances that led to the attack. There was no reported argument, no known gang connection, no clear motive placed on the public record. What investigators had was a body, a weapon, and one man in a cell built for two. But if the case seemed straightforward on the day it happened, why has no public conviction ever been announced? The killing was referred to the California State Prison Sacramento Investigative Services Unit, and then to the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office. As of the making of this video, no charge, no plea, and no trial outcome has been publicly reported for Taylor Cervantes in connection with the death of Edward Bergman. In cases where the suspect is already serving a life sentence, prosecutors sometimes weigh whether an additional trial changes the practical outcome. Whether that reasoning applies here is not stated on the public record. What is known is that Cervantes remains in the custody of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, serving the life sentence that brought him to Folsom in the first place. There is one detail worth noting from the same 24-hour period. On the same day that Bergman was found dead, another inmate at the facility, 46-year-old Mario Rushing, also died. Rushing had been convicted of murder in San Diego County. The two deaths were not connected in any public filing, but the coincidence of two homicides at a single institution in a single day was a preview of what the years ahead would look like at New Folsom. In 2024 alone, the facility would record 4 homicides. In the first 3 months of 2025, it would record 3 more. As of early 2026, Taylor Cervantes remains housed at California State Prison, Sacramento. Edward Bergman's case remains, in the language of public records, undocumented at the disposition level. His family has not spoken publicly. His body was buried under the sentence that had held him for nearly 3 decades. The killing of Edward Bergman was one of many that would take place inside the walls of New Folsom in the years that followed. Some of them would follow the same pattern of a suspect quickly identified and then quietly moved deeper into the system. Others would be far louder. The next name on this list belongs to a man whose violence began long before he ever entered a prison yard, and whose attacks would eventually move from cellmates to the staff paid to guard them. Jason Brannigan. Some men enter prison for one crime and eventually settle into the rhythm of incarceration. Jason Brannigan did the opposite. He arrived at the intake gates in March of 2011 on a 17-year and 8-month sentence for domestic violence, criminal threats, and vandalism out of Sacramento County. 14 years later, at the age of 47, he would kill a man inside a maximum security housing block at California State Prison, Sacramento. And less than a year after that, he would allegedly try to kill 2 correctional officers with a weapon he had built himself. The original conviction had brought him in on a domestic violence case that included corporal injury to a spouse, felony criminal threats, and property damage. It was the kind of sentence that, under normal conditions, would have put him in front of a parole board while he was still in his 40s. But inside prison, Brannigan continued to accrue new charges. On February 28th of 2022, Kern County added another 4-year term for possession or manufacture of a deadly weapon while incarcerated. The additions pushed his release date back and confirmed a pattern that would keep escalating. Lamar Scott was 35 years old on the evening of December 16th, 2024. Like Brannigan, he had been sent to Folsom on a domestic violence conviction, serving a 16-year term for corporal injury against a partner. The other man drawn into the attack that night was 71-year-old Santana West, a lifer serving under California's 3 strikes law. Both men were housed on the same yard as Brannigan. According to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, at approximately 6:04 on the evening of December 16, 2024, Brannigan attacked Scott with an improvised weapon inside the housing unit. Scott was stabbed multiple times. In the moments that followed, Brannigan swung the same weapon at West, striking him but not killing him. Officers intervened. West was hospitalized and survived. Scott was pronounced dead at the scene. Brannigan was moved to restricted housing while the investigation began. For most of the men housed in that block, the story would have ended there. Brannigan was already looking at additional time. But less than 11 months later, on November 1st of 2025, at approximately 7 in the evening, officers escorting Brannigan from his cell for a routine search were attacked with an improvised weapon. Both officers were struck. Both required hospitalization. Both were reported in fair condition in the hours that followed. How had a man with a stacked sentence and no realistic path to freedom been allowed to manufacture and hide another weapon inside a maximum security prison? The question sits inside a larger investigation that state officials have been dealing with for years. In June of 2025, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation placed 21 of its highest security facilities on modified programming, a partial lockdown that suspended visits and phone calls. Officials cited a surge in violence and drug overdoses. When searches were conducted, they recovered 193 improvised weapons across those institutions, along with more than 400 cellular devices and dozens of hypodermic needles. The Brannigan attack in November took place after 9 of those 21 facilities had already been rolled back off modified programming. Both incidents were referred to the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office. The killing of Lamar Scott is under review for a murder prosecution. The attack on the 2 correctional officers is under review as attempted homicide. As of early 2026, no charges have been filed publicly in either case, and no plea has been entered. Brannigan remains in restricted housing at California State Prison, Sacramento. Santana West, the 71-year-old who was struck during the December 2024 attack, was released from the hospital and returned to the facility. Lamar Scott's family has not appeared in public reporting. His name appears in the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation press release, and in the local coverage that followed, and then in nothing else. He was 35 years old. The Brannigan case is one of a growing category of incidents inside the California prison system that involve men killing while already serving long sentences, then attacking again while already awaiting review for the first killing. It is a pattern that appears repeatedly in the files coming out of New Folsom. But the next man on this list took it further than anyone. In the span of a single calendar year, he would be linked to the deaths of 3 separate men inside the same prison, one of whom had been standing beside him during the killing that came only 2 weeks before. Tyler Yates. Tyler Yates arrived at the California prison system in October of 2017 with an 8-year sentence for first-degree burglary and assault. He was 22 years old. What made his case unusual was not the sentence he came in on. It was what happened inside the walls of California State Prison, Sacramento in the years that followed. Between the spring of 2022 and the spring of 2025, Tyler Yates would be tied to the deaths of 3 men inside that facility, including his own cellmate, and including a second man who had been standing beside him during the killing that came only 2 weeks before. The first killing came on March 26th of 2022. Yates, working with another inmate named Gregory Roach, attacked 33-year-old Nathan Marcus on the recreation yard. The attack was fatal. Officers responded and separated the men. Marcus was pronounced dead. Yates and Roach were both charged and referred to the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office. The prosecution went to trial. On February 2nd of 2024, Yates was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole for first-degree murder, with the sentence stacked as a second striker in light of the in-prison offense. Roach received a similar disposition. Nathan Marcus's family, according to the limited public reporting that followed, was left with the same kind of closure the California prison system regularly delivers in these cases, which is a conviction that adds a life sentence to men already serving one. The second killing came a year later. On February 23rd of 2025, on the main exercise yard at California State Prison, Sacramento, Yates and another inmate named Jake Kennedy attacked and killed 39-year-old Jonathan Rood. Officers recovered 2 inmate-manufactured weapons from the scene. Rood was pronounced dead. Kennedy and Yates were moved to restricted housing while the investigation began. But the story did not end there. 2 weeks later, on March 7th of 2025, correctional officers arrived at the cell shared by Tyler Yates and Jake Kennedy and found Kennedy unresponsive on the floor. Kennedy had been stabbed to death. Yates was restrained without incident and identified as the sole suspect. 2 weeks earlier, the 2 of them had killed a man together on the exercise yard. Now one of them was dead in a cell they had been sharing, and the other was being let out in restraints. What would drive a man to kill his own cellmate 2 weeks after they had committed a killing together on the yard? The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation did not release a motive, and the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office has not filed public charges as of early 2026. Investigators would have been looking at the standard set of possibilities that emerge in prison homicides. There was the possibility that Kennedy had begun cooperating with investigators after the Rood killing, that Yates or someone above him had decided he was a witness who could not be allowed to testify. There was the possibility of a personal dispute that had escalated inside a closed room with no witnesses. There was also the possibility that a shot caller, operating from another facility or from within the same one, had ordered the killing. None of those possibilities have been publicly confirmed. What is on the record is the timeline. In the space of 13 months, Tyler Yates was tied to 3 killings inside a single prison. The Marcus killing had been prosecuted to conviction. The Rude killing and the Kennedy killing sit with the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office. He was 30 years old at the time of the 3rd killing. The additional prosecutions, if pursued, would primarily foreclose the possibility of parole. In California, a life with parole sentence is not a guaranteed release, but it is a hearing. Additional first-degree murder convictions, particularly those carrying special circumstances, can move a defendant to a life without parole sentence, which forecloses that hearing entirely. Whether that is the outcome Yates is heading toward is not yet public. As of early 2026, Tyler Yates is being held in restricted housing at California State Prison, Sacramento. 2 of the 3 killings tied to him are pending. The 3rd has been adjudicated. All 3 victims were adult men serving prison sentences of their own. All 3 deaths took place inside the same institution within a single calendar year window. The Yates case shows what state investigators have been documenting for years. Inside a facility that holds men least likely to be deterred by more time, the killings compound. But if a killer with a knife is one kind of danger, a killer who has spent decades learning how to attack the men in uniforms is another. The man whose case comes next has spent more than 2 decades building a record aimed almost entirely at correctional staff. John C. Blaylock. John C. Blaylock had been building a record of violence against correctional officers for more than 2 decades by the morning of March 9, 2026. He had appeared on court dockets across at least 3 California counties. He had already been convicted of the murder of 1 correctional officer in a case that took nearly 18 years to reach a courtroom. And on that morning, at approximately 10:15, according to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, he attacked another correctional officer inside California State Prison, Sacramento, with an improvised weapon, stabbing him multiple times. The pattern had started long before New Folsom. On June 23 of 2004, Blaylock was received into the California prison system out of Los Angeles County on a sentence of life with the possibility of parole for the attempted first-degree murder of a peace officer or firefighter. He was classified as a 3rd striker and had firearm enhancements attached to the case. He was in his mid-30s. He would never be released. The following year, still inside prison, he committed the crime that would define his record for the next 2 decades. In 2005, at the California Institution for Men in Chino in San Bernardino County, Blaylock fatally stabbed a correctional officer named Manuel Gonzalez. The case would take nearly 18 years to reach final adjudication. On August 16 of 2023, Blaylock was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for the 2nd-degree murder of a peace officer in prison. The sentence eliminated any theoretical pathway to release that his earlier life with parole sentences had left open. Between the killing of Gonzalez and the final conviction for that killing, Blaylock had committed at least 1 other documented in-prison offense. On November 4 of 2014, he was sentenced to another life term with the possibility of parole for assault with a deadly weapon inside a prison facility. By the time the events of March 9, 2026 arrived, John Blaylock was 56 years old, was serving a life without parole sentence for the murder of a correctional officer, and had accrued 3 separate life sentences over the course of his time in custody. He had spent more of his adult life inside prison than outside of it. And in the accounting of what the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation calls his commitment offense history, Every entry involved violence against law enforcement. The attack on the morning of March 9th followed a familiar pattern. At approximately 10:15, in a cell block inside the maximum security facility, Blaylock allegedly attacked a correctional officer with an improvised weapon. The officer was stabbed multiple times, sustaining what the department described as puncture wounds. He was transported to a hospital, treated, and reported in good condition, and awaiting discharge. The incident was investigated as attempted homicide. Why does a man serving 3 life sentences, one of them without the possibility of parole, continue to attack the officers assigned to guard him? The answer offered by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation is the same answer that appears in most of these files, which is that there is no additional legal consequence severe enough to deter a man who is already serving life without parole. Under state law, the maximum available sentence for the attempted murder of a correctional officer inside a facility is another life term stacked on top of the one he is already serving. That fact has been cited by the Los Angeles Times in reporting on the broader surge of violence at California State Prison, Sacramento, as one of the structural drivers of the pattern. There is one small housekeeping matter worth mentioning about this case. When the March 9th attack was first reported, at least one Los Angeles television station identified the suspect as Christopher Blaylock. That was a reporting error. His correct legal name, as documented by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, is John C. Blaylock. The individual and the criminal history are the same. The name is not. The March 9th incident was referred to the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office for possible felony prosecution. As of early 2026, no charge has been publicly filed. Blaylock has been moved to restricted housing at California State Prison, Sacramento, where he continues to serve his life without parole sentence for the murder of Correctional Officer Manuel Gonzalez. The officer who was stabbed on the morning of March 9th has not been publicly identified. He survived. His name, according to the departmental statement, is being withheld pending notification of family. His return to duty, if he returns, has not been publicly reported. The Blaylock case is one of the clearest examples in the new Folsom files of a recurring pattern, which is the presence of men whose entire criminal identity is defined by attacking correctional staff. But if John Blaylock is a man who has aimed his violence at staff for 2 decades, the next man on this list is a different kind of figure. He is a killer whose most publicized attack was captured on surveillance video, whose victim was handcuffed at the moment of his death, and whose alleged role was that of a hired hand carrying out an order from another inmate. Cody R. Taylor. On the afternoon of December 12, 2019, a 29-year-old man named Luis Giovanni Aguilar was stabbed to death inside a day room at California State Prison, Sacramento. He was handcuffed. He was seated in a chair. He was in one of the most restrictive housing units in the state, in a room officers were supposed to be watching. The attack was captured on surveillance video. The video would eventually leak, and the question that followed was not who had done it. It was how a handcuffed man had been reachable at all. Cody R. Taylor was known inside the system by the nickname Monster. He had entered the California prison system on May 8th of 2013 out of Ventura County on a 6-year and 4-month term for second-degree robbery, a drug offense, and an in-prison weapon count. He was a second striker at the time. Over the next several years, additional sentences were added on. In 2014, Kern County sentenced him for attempted second-degree murder and weapon possession. By the time the Aguilar killing took place, Taylor had spent most of his adult life inside California prisons and had a documented history of violence. Luis Giovanni Aguilar was serving a 4-year sentence out of a vehicle theft and evading conviction. By the standards of the men housed around him, he was a short-timer. He was 29 years old. He was handcuffed at the moment of his death. According to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, the attack happened inside the long-term restricted housing day room on B facility at approximately mid-afternoon. When staff intervened, Aguilar was pronounced dead. Taylor and a second inmate named Anthony Rodriguez were separated from the scene. An investigation was opened almost immediately, and Sacramento County prosecutors began building a case. Taylor pleaded no contest. On May 22nd of 2020, he was sentenced to 100 years to life, plus an additional 2 years, for attempted first-degree murder, and weapon possession, with the sentence stacked as a third striker. In the language of California sentencing, the plea foreclosed any realistic path to release. He was 27 years old at the time of sentencing. The case would have ended there. On paper, it did not. Court records reviewed by the investigative reporting team at KQED described the killing as an ordered hit, allegedly directed by another inmate named Dion Green. Green, according to court filings cited in the reporting, was a self-described gang shot caller who was said to have influenced Taylor and Rodriguez to carry out the attack. Aguilar had been in restricted housing, in restraints, and in a supposedly monitored day room, and yet 2 men had been able to reach him with manufactured weapons. How does a handcuffed man in a maximum security prison end up being stabbed to death in a room that officers are supposed to be watching? That question drove the investigation that followed. A federal civil rights inquiry was opened. KQED, in its multi-part reporting project titled On Our Watch, produced episodes examining whether correctional officers had facilitated the killing by opening doors that should have remained locked and by moving inmates who should have remained separated. Surveillance footage from the incident was leaked. Officials from the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation eventually acknowledged the ongoing investigation, but declined to characterize its findings while it was open. The Aguilar killing became one of several cases cited by state investigators and by the Los Angeles Times as evidence that California State Prison Sacramento had a culture problem that ran deeper than any one inmate or any one incident. It was one of the reasons the facility began to be publicly described as the most violent prison in the state. But Cody R. Taylor was not finished. On January 15th of 2025, more than 5 years after the Aguilar killing, Taylor and another inmate named David Gomez attacked a 36-year-old man named Mario Campbell on the main exercise yard. Campbell was killed. 3 inmate-manufactured weapons were recovered from the scene. Gomez, according to public records, was himself a convicted rapist who had received a second life term in 2015 for the killing of his own cellmate. Taylor was 32 years old. The Campbell killing was referred to the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office and remains pending as of early 2026. Taylor continues to serve the 100 years to life sentence that was imposed in 2020. He is currently housed in restricted status at California State Prison, Sacramento. 2 of the killings tied to him have been publicly reported. 1 has been adjudicated and sentenced. The other remains under review. The federal civil rights inquiry connected to the Aguilar case, according to public reporting, has not been publicly closed. If you're finding this look inside Folsom worth your time, take a second to subscribe. It helps this channel keep making these deep dives. Boris Bonilla. Of all the killings that have taken place at a facility named Folsom in the past decade, all but one happened at the newer, more secure institution built in 1986. One of them did not. On the evening of July 18, 2025, a 34-year-old man named Brian Diguez was attacked and killed inside the day room of Folsom State Prison, the original one, Opened in 1880 and preserved in cultural memory largely because of the live album Johnny Cash recorded there in 1968. The man identified as the primary suspect in Diguez's death was a 48-year-old lifer named Boris Bonilla. To understand the significance of the location, it helps to know that the two facilities that share the name Folsom are, in operational terms, entirely different institutions. Old Folsom, formerly Folsom State Prison, is a medium-security prison holding lower-level offenders. New Folsom, formerly California State Prison Sacramento, is a Level 4 maximum security prison holding the most dangerous inmates in the state. The overwhelming majority of the homicides publicly reported at a Folsom facility in the last decade have taken place at the newer prison. The Bonilla case is the exception. Boris Bonilla had been in the California prison system since May 17 of 2012. He had been received from Los Angeles County on a sentence of life with the possibility of parole for first-degree murder. The conviction carried enhancements for intentional discharge of a firearm causing great bodily injury or death, along with a criminal street gang enhancement. The specific gang was not identified in the departmental record. He was 35 years old when he entered the system. He was 48 years old on the evening of the Diguez killing. Brian Diguez was 34. He was serving a 21-year term for voluntary manslaughter out of Los Angeles County. His conviction also carried a street gang enhancement. According to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, at approximately 6:28 on the evening of July 18, 2025, Bonilla and another inmate named Carlos Duran attacked Diguez in the day room of the General Population Housing Unit, where all three men were housed. 2 inmate-manufactured weapons were recovered from the scene. Life-saving measures were attempted. Diguez was pronounced dead at 7:09 that evening. The department did not release the specific motive. The presence of 2 street gang enhancements on the records of the men involved, one on Bonilla and one on Diguez, was noted in the public reporting that followed, but was not characterized as a confirmed cause. If the General Population Day Room of Old Folsom had previously been considered a safer environment than the yards of the maximum security prison next door, what did the Diguez killing tell investigators about the state of the older facility? The answer, in the reporting that came out in the weeks and months that followed, was that the older prison had been drifting in the same direction as the newer one for several years. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation had already placed 21 of its highest security facilities on modified programming in June of 2025, only weeks before the Diguez attack, in response to a broader surge in prison violence and drug overdoses across the state. Old Folsom itself has a violent history that predates the newer prison entirely. From 1895 through 1937, the state carried out 93 executions inside its walls. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation itself has described the facility's history as one marked by riots and escape attempts that killed both inmates and staff. The Bonilla case was referred to the Folsom State Prison Investigative Services Unit and then to the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office. Both were investigating the death alongside the Sacramento County Coroner as of the last public update. As of early 2026, no charges have been filed publicly against Bonilla for the death of Brian Diguez. He remains in restricted housing at Folsom State Prison. His co-attacker, Carlos Duran, is being held under the same status pending review. Brian Diguez's remains were returned to his family. He was serving out a manslaughter conviction and had multiple years remaining on his sentence at the time of his death. Public reporting has not produced any statement from his family or from the sentencing court in Los Angeles County that originally handled his manslaughter case. The Bonilla case is, in a narrow sense, an anomaly on this list because of its location. In a broader sense, It fits the pattern state investigators have been tracking, which is that the underlying violence has been moving across facility lines. Where the Bonilla case sits in the pending review column, the man whose case comes next produced the clearest and most fully adjudicated outcome on this entire list. 2 consecutive life sentences imposed for 2 separate killings inside the same prison. Nicholas Mangelli. Nicholas Mangelli had already been sentenced to life without the possibility of parole by the time he was received into the California prison system in March of 2014. He was 23 years old. His conviction had come out of Sacramento County for a first-degree murder committed in 2013, an attack in which he stabbed a friend 74 times during what prosecutors described as a meth-fueled robbery. Over the next 8 years, inside the walls of California State Prison, Sacramento, Nicholas Mangelli would kill 2 more men. And unlike most of the cases on this list, his case would end in a full conviction and sentence. The original offense had been unusually violent, even by the standards of the cases that end in a life without parole plea. According to reporting in the Sacramento Bee, the victim in that original attack was a friend of Mangelli's, described in the coverage as a wounded Iraq War veteran. The 74 stab wounds were inflicted over the course of a robbery that Mangelli later pleaded guilty to in Sacramento County Superior Court in January of 2014. He was sentenced 2 months later. He would never be released. The first killing inside prison came on May 30th of 2019. Mangelli was 28 years old. Working with another inmate named Joshua Kerr, he attacked a 63-year-old man named Charles Anthony Ross on the exercise yard of B facility at California State Prison, Sacramento. Ross had been serving a life without parole sentence out of Riverside County since 1997 for a first-degree murder and robbery. He was in his early 60s on the day of the attack, and he had been inside prison for more than 20 years. According to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, Ross was stabbed in the head and chest between 15 and 20 times. Officers responded and deployed pepper spray. A blast grenade was used to separate the men. Ross was pronounced dead. Mangelli and Kerr were both moved to restricted housing. The second killing came just over 3 years later. On July 23rd of 2022, Mangelli, this time working with a different inmate named Darrell Cull, attacked a 59-year-old man named Wayne Caskey on a maximum security exercise yard at the same prison. Caskey, like Ross, had been serving a life without parole sentence for first-degree murder. Manufactured weapons were used. Officers deployed 40mm less lethal rounds to stop the attack. Caskey was pronounced dead. 2 victims, both lifers, both convicted first-degree murderers, both attacked and killed by the same man inside the same facility, 3 years apart. What kind of prison prosecution follows a pattern like this? The answer came in April of the following year. The Sacramento County District Attorney's Office announced that Mangelli had been convicted in a jury trial of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Each count carried the special circumstance of a prior first-degree murder finding, an enhancement that under California law elevates the potential sentence to death or life without the possibility of parole. Mangelli was sentenced to 2 consecutive life without parole terms to be served on top of the life without parole sentence he was already serving for the 2013 killing that had brought him into the system. In practical terms, the sentence was symbolic. Mangelli was already serving a sentence that guaranteed he would die inside prison. The addition of 2 more life without parole terms did not change his release date, because he had no release date. What the sentence did was foreclose any theoretical possibility of a future commutation, gubernatorial clemency, or retroactive change in sentencing law that might have applied to his earlier conviction alone. It also placed on the public record, in a courtroom rather than in a departmental press release, the fact that Nicholas Mangeli was responsible for the deaths of Charles Anthony Ross and Wayne Caskey. As of early 2026, Nicholas Mangeli is serving 3 consecutive life without parole sentences at a California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation facility. His current housing status is not publicly detailed. The families of Charles Ross and Wayne Caskey received the conviction and sentence they had been waiting for through the roughly 4 years that separated the first killing from the announcement of the verdict. Public statements from either family have not been broadly circulated. The Mangeli case is unusual on this list, precisely because it ended in a completed prosecution. Most of the killings profiled here sit in what departmental records refer to as pending review. His case sits in the completed column. But that outcome is the exception rather than the rule. The man whose case comes next also produced a full conviction for his first killing. His second killing, only months later, sits in the same pending column that most of these files inhabit. Gregory Roach. Gregory Roach's name has already appeared once on this list, in the case of Tyler Yates, as the co-attacker in the March 26, 2022 killing of Nathan Marcus. Roach was convicted for that killing and sentenced to life with the possibility of parole in February of 2024. But the Marcus killing was not the only homicide Gregory Roach would be linked to at California State Prison, Sacramento. In July of 2024, 5 months after his sentencing, Roach and 2 other inmates would attack and kill a 55-year-old man named Randy Schleipfer inside the same facility that had held him through the first case. Roach had entered the California prison system out of San Diego County. His record before Folsom was made up largely of nonviolent offenses. In 2014, he had received a term connected to elder theft charges and to the possession of firearms and ammunition. On October 15th of 2019, he was sentenced to 12 years for assault likely to produce great bodily injury. He was classified as a second striker. He was in his late 20s. The March 2022 killing of Nathan Marcus, committed alongside Tyler Yates, was Roach's first documented homicide. He was convicted of first-degree murder in a Sacramento County trial. On February 2nd of 2024, he was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole, with the sentence stacked as a third striker in light of the in-prison offense. Under California law, a life with the possibility of parole sentence for a first-degree murder does not become eligible for review until the defendant has served a minimum of 25 years, meaning that Gregory Roach would be in his 50s before any parole hearing became legally possible. Randy Schleipfer, the man killed in July of 2024, was 55 years old at the time of his death. He was serving 2 life sentences of his own. The first had come out of Tulare County in 1995 for a second-degree murder conviction. The second had been added in 2015 for an in-prison assault committed inside another California facility. He had been in the state prison system for nearly 3 decades. He had already been the target of previous prison violence. According to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, on July 14th of 2024, Roach was one of 3 inmates who attacked Schleipfer inside a housing area at California State Prison, Sacramento. The 2 co-attackers were named Ronald Ricks, a 38-year-old, and Greg Reynolds, a lifer serving a life without parole sentence for first-degree murder. 2 inmate-manufactured weapons were recovered from the scene. Ricks was himself injured during the attack, which meant that of the 4 men involved, 3 had committed serious harm on the 4th, and one of the 3 attackers had come out of the incident bleeding badly enough to require hospitalization. Ricks was hospitalized in fair condition. Schleipfer was pronounced dead. What explains a case in which a man convicted of a prison killing in February goes on to commit a second prison killing 5 months later in the same facility, on essentially the same yard? The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation has not offered a public explanation. The Schlepfer case is one of several that state investigators have cited when discussing what the Los Angeles Times has described as the seemingly impunity-based dynamic driving the violence at New Folsom. When a man is already serving life with the possibility of parole, with a minimum of 25 years before any hearing, and when the addition of a second murder conviction would move him only to another life sentence, the marginal legal deterrence available to the state is limited. The pattern has been documented in the departmental data on in-prison homicides, and Roach's case sits squarely within it. The July 2024 killing of Randy Schlepfer was referred to the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office. As of early 2026, no public charge has been filed against Roach or his co-attackers in that case. Ricks, who was hospitalized after the attack, was returned to the facility. Reynolds, who was already serving life without parole for first-degree murder, continues under the same sentence. Roach continues to serve the life with the possibility of parole sentence that was imposed in February of 2024 for the Marcus killing. Randy Schlepfer had been in the California prison system for close to 30 years. He was, by the time of his death, in his mid-50s. His original conviction had come out of an earlier era of California sentencing. His name appears in the departmental record and in the local coverage that followed the July 14th attack, and then largely disappears from public reporting. Gregory Roach remains housed at California State Prison, Sacramento. He is now in his mid-30s. His documented role in 2 separate killings inside the same institution places him within a small category of California inmates who have been publicly identified as double killers inside the same facility. But if Roach's pattern is one of 2 killings across 2 years, the following case involves a man whose sole documented in-prison killing produced no public prosecution at all, more than 3 years after his cellmate was found dead on the floor beside him. Shamar L. Thornton. On the morning of January 8, 2022, at approximately 6:53, correctional officers arrived at a cell inside California State Prison, Sacramento, and found a 37-year-old inmate named DeAndre Lewis unresponsive on the floor. Life-saving measures were attempted. He was pronounced dead 30 minutes later. His cellmate, a 36-year-old man named Shamar Thornton, was identified as the suspect. Thornton was already serving a life without parole sentence for a first-degree murder conviction out of San Bernardino County dating back to 2009. And more than 3 years later, no public record has ever been produced showing what happened to the case against him. Thornton had been received into the California prison system on June 11th of 2009. His sentence was life without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder, with a concurrent 3-year term for corporal injury inflicted on a spouse or cohabitant. He was in his early 20s at the time. He would spend the entirety of his adult life inside prison. DeAndre Lewis, the man found dead on the cell floor that morning, had been serving a life sentence with the possibility of parole. His record was one of the more extensive on this list. It included convictions for aiding and abetting rape, forcible rape, torture, human trafficking with a firearm, pimping, and false imprisonment. He was 37 years old. The 2 men had been housed together as cellmates at the time of Lewis's death. That housing decision, which is made at the departmental level and involves an assessment of compatibility between inmates, would become one of the questions hovering over the case in the absence of a public prosecution. According to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, officers arrived at the cell on the morning of January 8th in response to the discovery that Lewis was unresponsive. Life-saving efforts were attempted. Lewis was pronounced dead at approximately 7:23. Thornton was named as the sole suspect. The Investigative Services Unit at California State Prison, Sacramento, opened the investigation, and the Office of the Inspector General was notified. This is the standard procedure for in-prison homicides in California, and the process is designed to route the case through the departmental review structure before it is passed to the local district attorney. If the standard process was followed, why has no public prosecution of Shamar Thornton for the killing of DeAndre Lewis ever been reported? The answer, based on the public record, is that either no charges were filed, or charges were filed and disposed of without producing a court event that made its way into public reporting. Both are possible. Neither has been confirmed. In cases where the suspect is already serving a life without parole sentence, prosecutors in some California counties have historically declined to file additional charges on the reasoning that the defendant is already serving the maximum available sentence, and that the marginal benefit of an additional trial does not justify the resource commitment. The Sacramento County District Attorney's Office has not publicly commented on the specific reasoning in Thornton's case. There are also cases in which departmental discipline is imposed internally without a public prosecution ever taking place. Under California regulations, in-prison offenses can be adjudicated through the departmental rules violation process, which can result in loss of privileges, credit forfeiture, and long-term restricted housing placement, without a criminal court ever hearing the matter. Whether any such internal proceedings have occurred in Thornton's case is not publicly recorded. As of early 2026, Shamar Thornton remains in the custody of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. He continues to serve the life without parole sentence that has held him since 2009. His current housing status is not publicly detailed. The Lewis case has not been publicly resolved at the disposition level. DeAndre Lewis's remains were returned to his family. His extensive violent record does not remove the fact that his death, whatever the circumstances, occurred inside a facility under the custody of the state. The California prison system has a legal duty of care over the men and women it holds, including those serving life sentences for the most serious crimes. The Lewis case is one of several in which that duty has been examined in the aftermath of a fatal incident, and in which the resulting review has not produced a public accounting. The Thornton case sits alongside the Cervantes case as one of the two on this list in which a suspect was named, an investigation was opened, and no visible follow-through has been publicly reported. But if a case with an unclear disposition from 3 years ago is unusual, a case with an unclear disposition from more than a decade ago belongs to a different category entirely. The last case in this look at Folsom is one whose alleged act of violence took place in the early morning hours of December 2011, and whose file has produced fewer public records still. Maurice Woodson. In the early morning hours of December 10, 2011, at approximately 3:10, correctional officers arrived at a cell inside a maximum security housing unit at California State Prison, Sacramento, and found a 38-year-old inmate named Anthony Stedham unresponsive and injured. Medical personnel worked on him for nearly 2 hours. He was pronounced dead just after 5 in the morning. His cellmate, a 43-year-old man named Maurice Woodson, was identified as the suspect. The killing came only 3 days after a large riot at the same facility, and more than a decade later, the public record contains no documented charge, plea, or conviction for what happened in that cell. Woodson had been in the California prison system since April of 2001. His sentence was more than 46 years for attempted murder and assault with a firearm. He would have been in his early 30s when he entered the system, and in his early 40s by the time of the December 2011 incident. On his sentence structure, He was on track to remain in prison well into his 70s before any release consideration would become relevant. Anthony Stedham was 38 years old and had been in the California prison system since 1997. He was serving a life without parole sentence for first-degree murder out of San Mateo County. His conviction had come out of a 1993 armed robbery spree, during which the victim of the underlying murder was a 43-year-old man named Thomas Simonis, a cab driver from San Jose. Stedham had been convicted in 1997. By the time he was housed with Woodson in the fall of 2011, he had already spent nearly 15 years inside the California prison system. The context around the December 10th killing is important. 3 days earlier, on December 7th of 2011, the same facility had experienced a large-scale riot involving approximately 150 inmates. 11 were injured in the disturbance. The Stedham killing followed within 72 hours. The departmental record does not directly connect the two events, but the timing places the killing within a period of visible instability at the institution. According to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, and to local reporting from the time, officers responded to the cell after Stedham was found injured. Life-saving measures were attempted for nearly 2 hours. Stedham was pronounced dead at just after 5 in the morning. Woodson was identified as the sole suspect. The case was referred to the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office and to the Departmental Investigative Services Unit. What happened next, in terms of the public record, is nothing. Why does a killing inside a maximum security prison, with a clearly identified suspect and a full departmental response, produce no publicly searchable court disposition more than a decade later? The answer, again, is a combination of the two possibilities that recur throughout this list. Either no charges were filed, on the standard reasoning that the suspect was already serving a very long sentence, and that additional prosecution offered limited marginal benefit, or charges were filed and disposed of in a way that did not generate the kind of court event that appears in publicly searchable databases. In older cases from the pre-electronic records era of California court filings, dispositions of this kind can be genuinely difficult to trace even for professional court researchers. There is one important note that has to be made in connection with this case, because the name Morris Woodson is not unique in the United States public record. In 2021, a completely different man named Maurice Woodson, born in the mid-1980s, was sentenced in federal court in Missouri to 276 months, or approximately 23 years, in a case involving cocaine trafficking and a murder-for-hire conviction. That case is entirely separate from this one. It is a different person, in a different state, with a different date of birth, prosecuted in a different court on entirely different facts. Any conflation of the two would be a factual error. As of the most recent public information available, Morris Woodson, the California prison inmate born in the late 1960s, remains in the custody of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation on the more than 46-year sentence that brought him into the system in 2001. His current housing status is not publicly detailed. The legal disposition of the killing of Anthony Stedham is not publicly documented and has not been reported by any known news outlet in the years since the incident. Anthony Stedham's family, according to the obituary that ran at the time, buried him in the aftermath of a life that had been defined for most of its adult length by the crime he had committed in the early 1990s. His original victim, Thomas Simonis, the cab driver whose death sent Stedham to life without parole, had been buried nearly 2 decades before Stedham's own death in the cell. They had both, in different ways, ended up housed inside. The Woodson case is the oldest on this list and the least publicly resolved. It is a case in which the departmental record establishes what happened, the suspect is named, and the disposition does not exist in any form the public can search. That is where the record on these 10 cases stands as of early 2026. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.